When does a writer stop telling a story and start delivering a verdict? When does a moral story stop inviting the audience to discover truth and start coercing them into agreement? Here's the line I want you to hold on to today. The moment a story uses shame to try to force you to adopt a conclusion, it stops being a story and becomes propaganda. And audiences feel it immediately. Even if they can't articulate it, they sense it in their nervous system. They don't feel invited, they feel cornered. And that is not morally neutral. What's more is that it's not just an ethical problem, it's a structural one, because shame collapses moral clarity in both our personal lives and in story. So it makes people easy to manipulate. It makes characters morally compromised. And in both cases, it shuts down the process of discovery that keeps something from being propaganda. So today we're going to talk about shame, not just as a human experience, but as a craft issue, because shame is anti-story. And I'm going to address a number of issues related to how shame impacts storytelling, like how it can corrupt a character's arc, why villains rely on it, and why heroes must break its hold. And what you're going to discover is how the storyteller's job is not to remove shame from the story, but to right the moment it loses its power. Hello, and welcome to the Storyteller's Mission with Zena Dell Lowe. Let's get started. Part 1. Why writers are tempted to use shame. Writers are especially vulnerable to using shame in storytelling. Why? Because we care. We see injustice. We feel urgency. We want people to get it. Urgency can make us impatient with the audience's humanity. So we don't want to just persuade them. We want to force conclusions, but that is coercion and not truth-telling. Persuasion invites. Shame corners. That's the key distinction. Persuasion says, look with me, walk with me, consider this. Let's consider it together. Shame says, if you don't agree, you are morally defective. And once that becomes the subtext, your story becomes propaganda. Because propaganda doesn't allow the audience to discover. It demands assent. In propaganda, there are no mistaken protagonists, only corrupt ones. And the goal is not understanding, it's exposure. Truthful stories do something very different. They allow the audience to recognize themselves without being humiliated. They preserve the difference between wrongdoing and worth, between error and identity, between sin and sinner. And that isn't soft, that's moral realism. If you collapse people into verdicts, you are thinking like a villain. You are actually teaching villain logic. Villains love shame, which is why heroes must break free from it. Part 2, how shame functions in story. Shame doesn't just affect tone, it affects structure because it collapses identity into verdict. It says you didn't just make a mistake, you are the mistake. And this is why shame is the villain's favorite leverage. Shame turns a human into their own prison guard. If a character believes, I don't deserve redemption, or I must hide, or I owe someone, or I can't stand in the light, I'm going to be exposed, then they can be controlled. And they can be controlled without change. Blackmail works, coercion works, and just plain shaming them works. A villain doesn't need to physically restrain you if you're already restraining yourself. All or nothing thinking is the villain's logic. If you've done bad things, you are bad, period, all of it. That's the logic, by the way, that justifies cruelty. Because once someone is labeled evil, then anything that's done to them becomes righteous. It's fine. Therefore, villains collapse nuance. And they're not just doing that because they're evil, they're doing it because nuance weakens their control. Preserving moral complexity, on the other hand, is what restores moral agency. See, shame keeps people trapped. So the villain simplifies. Bad person, irredeemable, case closed. That logic justifies anything they choose to do. And that pattern isn't limited to fiction. You see it anywhere. Humans stop seeing one another as complex in families, in institutions, in movements, in politics. Villains cling to black and white narratives in order to justify their evil acts. It makes it simple. And it's exactly what we're seeing people do in culture. People today are fragile. Fewer and fewer people are able to see a bigger picture. We reduce people down to an essential core that essentially dehumanizes them. And we tend to do this to anybody who isn't like us. So here's the thing. Anyone who uses dehumanizing terms or language to describe a political leader or a political opponent is someone who is refusing nuance, refusing the complexity of humanity, and refusing to separate the sin from the sinner or actions from identity. And by the way, it happens on both sides of the aisle. When we describe other people as Nazis, fascists, racists, or whatever, that speaks to core identity, not just behaviors. The minute we see them as less than human, less deserving of human dignity and respect, that is when we become the villains. And that's when we justify our treatment of those that we have deemed evil. And it's a vicious cycle that continues to happen. It's so obvious, and yet it's so hard to stop doing it. When shame replaces understanding, cruelty becomes easier to justify. And this is why heroes must learn to differentiate. Villains say bad person. Heroes say broken person. There's a difference, because a broken person is capable of both good and evil. It humanizes them. That is the difference between, say, revenge stories and even dark stories that have a chance for redemption. Part 3, shame versus conviction. There's a crucial distinction between shame and conviction. Shame says, I am worthless. Conviction, on the other hand, says, I did something wrong. So shame is not the same thing, by the way, as just being morally aware, because shame erases agency, but conviction restores it. Shame immobilizes us, but conviction moves a character towards repentance, towards repair and truth. They have energy to try to change things, and that's why it becomes part of a character's arc when shame is being used in a story. Which leads me to part 4, why shame is anti-story. Stories require motion, but shame freezes it, because shame will collapse a character into a verdict. Good stories allow characters to be wrong without being worthless, to fail without being evil, and to learn without being humiliated. But once shame starts to govern a story or a character itself, then their character arc becomes impossible, because characters start just protecting their identity instead of pursuing truth. So that means that their character arc collapses. They're temporarily stalled. They are not moving forward when they are being shamed in a story, which means that you have to have a moment where they confront truth. So story becomes a verdict delivery system when shame is in control. But when truth enters, that's when the shame loses its power and agency returns to the character so that they can actually start to grow and change. So movement in story is oxygen. We need our characters to be moving forward, which is why you need to address whatever shame is keeping your character paralyzed and preventing them from moving forward in their own journey. Part 5, heroes preserve nuance. Heroes must preserve nuance in order to be heroic. And they have to do it even when they don't feel like it, even if they're angry or sad or whatever the case may be. Heroes need to be able to see the complexity of the other human beings in their orbit, no matter how bad the crime. That includes the villains. This is what actually allows them to live by a moral code rather than to start taking matters into their own hands. So this is how they confront evil without becoming it. We see this in what a character does differently than the other characters around them, how they speak to other characters and treat them with dignity, even when those characters have done horrible things, how they simply see others as broken rather than pure evil that they must destroy. Or they see the sadness. I mean, they can see a character as evil, but they also see a greater sadness. I mean, there's something about their perception of the way they're seeing the world that really impacts how you address this in story. So they confront evil without dehumanizing the other characters. The shame response and the villain logic will say something like, "You're a monster. You deserve what's coming." But a hero who's preserving nuance will say something different. They will say, "What you did was evil and you deserve justice. But I'm not going to become evil to stop you." That distinction preserves dignity, moral clarity, and character arc. Heroes are capable of seeing a person's depravity and dignity at the same time. That's all that means. And that paradox keeps them on the heroic path. Now, this is the heart of redemptive storytelling, and it's the antidote to shame. Shame says you're only broken, but truth says you're broken, but you're still valuable. That paradox restores motion and dictates how the heroic character behaves, since he cannot justify treating anyone as less than human. Therefore, he cannot seek revenge. He must seek justice. The hero lives by a code and always endeavors to do the right thing in the right way. So now I'm going to bring up an example. Part 6, About Schmidt. The climax of About Schmidt is one of the most quietly powerful demonstrations of this principle. So early on in the film, Schmidt is dismissive of other people. He's emotionally armored. He's protective, right? He's judgmental of everybody else. He's convinced that he sees everyone clearly. But that clarity is actually defensive superiority. It's a posture of superiority. And by the way, that's classic shame displacement. If I reduce everyone else, I don't have to face myself and what I have become. Schmidt isn't just grumpy. He's avoiding the terror that his life might not actually matter. But by this point in the story, he has finally been forced to confront the reality of his own moral failures. And it humbles him. So at the wedding, he has choices. He can choose to surrender his pride, or he can choose not to. If he surrenders his pride, it means he won't tell people what he really thinks of them, and he'll be gracious to the new son and his family. And what does Schmidt do? He chooses restraint and grace. That is dignity replacing shame. He allows others to exist as flawed human beings. That's a hero move. Then on the way home, Schmidt stops at the Pioneer exhibit and is impressed by all their hard work and toil and the legacy that they've left behind, all of us in this country. And he admits to Ndugu that his life hasn't meant anything, really. He hasn't made much of an impact at all. When he dies, which he will do relatively soon, his life won't have made much of a difference. Now, this could be shame, but in Schmidt's case, it isn't, because he's not spiraling when he says that. He's not hiding. He's not self-annihilating. He's not even performing. It's a moment of clarity. He is simply stating what is actually true about his life. It is conviction without self-destruction, and that's the difference. So one says, I am completely worthless, but the other says, I didn't live my life in the way that I hoped or fulfill the things that I thought I would. That's just truth. Truth restores agency and dignity. Shame erases it. And in this moment, Schmidt is honest without collapsing into shame. And that's when the final moment of the story happens. Schmidt is rewarded. He's rewarded for his honest humility because he gets a letter back from Ndugu. Now, listen, that letter is not validation. It doesn't say, oh, Schmidt, you're amazing just as you are. It says you made a difference in my life, and that's all that matters. And in that moment, Schmidt bursts into tears because he realizes his life has made a difference to this one person. His life matters, and it's enough. Heroes must be able to see broken humanity and dignity at the same time, including their own. Schmidt finally does that. He sees his own brokenness, but he doesn't collapse into self-hatred. He extends grace, and that is redemptive structure. Once he surrenders his pride, he can let go of his shame and just be honest. And when that happens, the universe can finally reward him with a life that matters. Notice he does not become a different personality. He just becomes honest. And that is powerful storytelling. Part 7, the hero's way out, conviction and repentance. A good arc doesn't actually eliminate the past. It doesn't try to erase a person's history or pretend it didn't happen. It reframes that history through the lens of truth. So a protagonist who is ashamed of something they've done in the past, they are already a morally compromised character. They cannot even see their own state clearly because they've been influenced by that shame. And that means that they can be easily manipulated by a villain, if there is one that exists. And strong characters understand a clear moral worldview, even if they start out morally compromised, which means they have to come to see the truth. The lie about their shame needs to be exposed. So if you have a story where the hero is struggling with shame from his own past, he can't be overcome by it, but he also can't deny what he did or drown in self-loathing. He has to overcome it. And he does that by separating the sin from the identity, by reclaiming their moral agency. Okay, I did that in the past, but here's who I am today, and I'm no longer going to let that control me. They have to refuse the villain's all or nothing frame, that just because they did something bad in the past doesn't mean they're all bad. They reject it. And that moment becomes a huge moment in their actual arc, in their story. So how does the character react? They need an encounter with truth. That encounter is necessarily going to be paradoxical because they're going to be able to see both their brokenness and their dignity at the same time. They've got to be able to be honest. They can't pretend, no, you know what I did in the past really wasn't that bad. No, it was bad. Whatever they did in the past, it was bad. And yet they're not going to let that define them anymore. So in humility, they'll be able to admit their weakness or their past sins. But in conviction, they'll be able to move forward to step in to the noble duty for which they've been called. True conviction leads to godly sorrow that produces a repentance. That's what we just experienced. And that repentance allows them to stop regretting the past and leads them into a future of hope. That is story structure. Part 8, the storyteller's responsibility. Again, the goal for you is not to remove shame. It can very much play a role in the story. Now, we've already talked about how it's good to remove shame if you're trying to shame your audience, right? We don't want to do that. Don't shame your audience. But if shame becomes part of the fabric of your character's journey, then don't remove it. Simply break its hold. That's the goal. Find a moment, construct a moment where they have an encounter with truth, and so that shame will no longer have control over them. That is where confession lives, right? That's where they can honestly state what they've done. But it's also where redemption lives, where now they're no longer defined by their past and they get to move forward to this glorious future. That's where heroism truly lives, and that's the moment of catharsis that both the character and the audience lives for. So yes, write the shame, but then write the moment that the shame loses its power. That is going to be the moment in your story that the audience leans forward, and that's going to satisfy your character's arc. So every time you open your story, ask, Where is my character freezing from shame? And what truth is going to loosen that grip? That moment, that exact moment, is where your story comes alive. It's going to be the magic that you're writing. Thank you for listening to The Storyteller's Mission with Zena Dell Lowe. May you go forth inspired to change the world for the better through story.